You keep asking, why is God silent? But what if he's not? What if he's been speaking the whole time, and you just stopped listening? Because the system doesn't silence God by removing his voice. It silences you by keeping you distracted. Every notification, every worry, every rush, they don't steal your faith. They steal your focus. And that's why heaven feels quiet. Not because God stopped talking, but because the noise became your new religion. Stay. Because what comes next will show you the 7 signs that God was never silent. You just couldn't hear him anymore. You wake up. But before your feet even touch the floor, the system already found you. The glow of your phone greets you faster than your own thoughts. The first sound of the day isn't prayer. It's a notification. You scroll, you check, you react. And without realizing it, your focus, your first offering, has already been taken. You used to wake up asking, God, what do you want from me today? Now the question is, what did I miss while I was sleeping? The system doesn't need to kill your faith to control you. It just needs to keep you loud, because a loud soul can't listen, and a distracted believer is already obedient. Every noise becomes sacred. The hum of news feeds, the rhythm of likes, the applause of strangers. They sound like meaning, but they're just static. Spiritual interference disguised as purpose. And that's how silence, once holy, became uncomfortable. You call it boredom. You call it anxiety. But silence is where God used to meet you. Now you fill that space with everything else, because stillness feels like failure in a world addicted to motion. The system reprogrammed your senses. You don't crave peace anymore. You crave stimulus. You don't search for presence. You search for relevance. And when God whispers, you miss it. Not because he's far, but because the volume of the world is higher. So you keep turning up the noise, hoping to find something divine in the digital. But the truth is, you can't hear heaven through a frequency owned by the system. And that's the first sign. God isn't silent. You just can't hear him over the idols that learned how to speak louder. You pray, but not like before. You don't feel the words anymore. You repeat them. It's not prayer. It's programming. A ritual your body remembers, but your soul no longer attends. You say, Amen, but your mind is already somewhere else, scrolling, planning, worrying, performing. Because the system found a way to monetize even your faith. It doesn't tell you to stop believing. It teaches you to believe faster. Shorter prayers, louder songs, quicker sermons. Everything optimized for attention, not connection. You call it devotion, but it's automation. You're not praying, you're performing. And performance is the perfect disguise for distraction. The system doesn't fear religion. It funds it. It loves your routines because they keep you predictable. It loves your words because they make you feel active, while your awareness stays asleep. You think God is silent because the rituals lost power. But maybe the rituals became noise, the echo of something that once connected you to heaven, now just bouncing off the walls of repetition. You pray with movement, not meaning. You speak with rhythm, not revelation. You worship out of habit, not hunger. And when heaven stays quiet, you assume it's a test. But maybe it's not a test. Maybe it's a wake-up call. Because silence isn't punishment. It's permission. Permission to stop the performance, to breathe, to listen, to remember that faith was never meant to be a schedule. It was meant to be a surrender. But surrender doesn't trend, and silence doesn't sell. So the system will do everything to keep you praying loudly, as long as you never pause long enough to actually hear what you're saying. That's how it wins. Not by making you lose faith, but by keeping it busy. And that's the second sign. God isn't silent. You just automated the relationship until it no longer required listening. You call it growth. You call it purpose. But heaven calls it noise with better branding. The system is clever. It learned that you'd never stop chasing God, so it built a version of him that never stops running. Now you measure your faith by metrics, views, reach, routines, results. You track your obedience like performance data, as if salvation had an algorithm. The system doesn't need to stop your progress. It just needs to redefine it. Because if you can keep moving, you'll never notice you're lost. You tell yourself you're evolving, but your peace hasn't moved an inch. You've become fluent in spiritual productivity, always doing, never being. You replaced presence with purpose. And the scariest part? You didn't even notice the switch. Now you pray for clarity, but your prayers sound like strategies. You ask for signs, but you treat them like goals. And when silence comes, you panic. Because the system taught you that if you're not achieving, you're falling behind. But in the kingdom of noise, stillness looks like failure. Waiting looks like weakness. And listening feels like losing. So you fill every second with something that looks meaningful, but was designed to drain you. You call it grind. You call it discipline. But God calls it distance. Because while you're chasing results in His name, you're forgetting His voice. You don't serve idols made of gold anymore. You serve the illusion of progress. And the system smiles because it knows that as long as you're busy for God, you'll never have time with God. That's the third sign. God isn't silent. You just confused motion for meaning. And the system profits every time you do. You keep saying God is quiet. But what if He's just speaking a language you stopped understanding? Because silence isn't emptiness. It's encryption. It's how God hides meaning from those who only listen with their ears. The system made you allergic to silence. It trained you to fill every gap, to escape every pause. But heaven doesn't speak in speed. It speaks in stillness. And that's why most people miss it. You wait for thunder, for signs, for miracles. But God hides in whispers. And whispers only reach the souls that stopped shouting. The system knows that. That's why it sells you noise disguised as purpose. Inspiration videos, motivation quotes, fake urgency. It's not trying to destroy your peace. It's trying to distract you from where peace actually begins. Because silence is the one frequency the system can't control. No algorithm can track your awareness. No notification can interrupt a moment of presence. That's where divine clarity lives, in the space between thoughts, where the world loses power and you become aware again. You think silence is God's absence, but silence is where God waits for the world to shut up. Every unanswered prayer, every delay, every quiet season is not punishment. It's preparation. Because sometimes God stops talking, so you'll finally stop repeating. And when you do, you start hearing what you were never patient enough to perceive. Not a voice in the clouds, but a voice in your consciousness. A sacred reminder that awareness is the altar. The world told you to speak your truth. God's been waiting for you to listen to His. And that's the fourth sign. God isn't silent. You just lost the ability to recognize His language, because silence doesn't sound holy anymore. The system doesn't hate believers. It needs them. Because the most loyal servant isn't the sinner. It's the distracted saint. You think the enemy wants you faithless? No. He wants you busy, preaching, posting, performing, anything that keeps you from listening. The system studied religion better than most believers did. It learned that if you can't silence God's voice, you can imitate it. So it built platforms that speak like prophets, but sell like merchants. It gives you preachers who perform miracles for clicks, and disciples who confuse visibility with virtue. It builds temples made of glass. We call them screens. And every scroll feels sacred. Every notification, divine. You don't kneel at altars anymore. You bow to updates. Because the system doesn't demand worship, it rewards distraction. It gives you the illusion of purpose and the dopamine of obedience. You think you're fighting the darkness, but the system is the light, artificial, constant, blinding. The kind of light that keeps you awake, but never aware. That's how control works in this age. Not through sin, but through stimulation. Not through fear, but through familiarity. You think God is testing your patience, but it's the system testing your loyalty. And every time you choose comfort over clarity, you pass its test, not His. Because the system's favorite believer isn't the one who doubts, it's the one who never stops performing in God's name, even when God stopped watching. And that's the fifth sign. God isn't silent. He's just refusing to compete with the counterfeit version of Him that the system built inside your screen. There's a moment the system loves, the exact moment when silence becomes isolation, and you start calling absence peace. It's subtle. You stop hearing God, but you tell yourself it's because you've evolved. You stop feeling conviction, but call it clarity. You stop seeking truth and call it rest. The system claps quietly, because now it doesn't need to distract you. You've become your own distraction. You wear your disconnection like a medal. You tell yourself, I'm finally at peace, when in reality, You've just stopped resisting. The system doesn't destroy your faith. It numbs it. It feeds you quiet that feels sacred, but it's just exhaustion dressed as enlightenment. You start avoiding depth because depth requires discomfort. You stop asking questions because questions might expose what your comfort hides. The system taught you to confuse burnout with balance, to call emptiness alignment, to praise detachment, as if detachment ever led anyone to divine awareness. And now you meditate, but not to meet God, to escape Him. You isolate yourself from noise, but also from conviction. That's the disconnection that feels holy, a calm so counterfeit it silences the call that once kept you alive. You tell yourself you're resting in faith, but what you're really doing is hiding from awareness, because silence, when guided by God, restores you, but silence, when sold by the system, erases you. That's the sixth sign. When your peace feels like absence instead of alignment, you're not transcending, you're disconnecting. And the system loves that version of you, the one who mistakes stillness for surrender and calls numbness divine. One day, the noise stops, not because the system let you go, but because you stopped responding. That's when the real test begins, because silence is easy when the world is screaming. But can you stay still when everything goes quiet? The system panics when you stop feeding it. It throws memories, fears, unfinished dreams, anything to make you scroll again. Because nothing terrifies control more than a mind that no longer obeys. You'll feel it, the urge to fill the silence, to open something, check something, fix something. That's the ghost of the system whispering, don't stay here, don't listen, don't think. But if you endure that moment, if you breathe through the discomfort, you'll start hearing what silence was hiding all along. God never stopped speaking. You just stopped being quiet enough to notice. And His voice won't sound like thunder or revelation. It'll sound like recognition, like remembering who you were before the world taught you what to chase. Because the silence that once scared you becomes the sound that saves you. The system built an empire on your attention, but attention is divine territory, and every second you reclaim it is rebellion disguised as prayer. You thought God was testing your faith. He was testing your focus. And now you finally understand why. Because faith without focus is noise, and focus without God is blindness. But when they meet, you hear again, you see again, you are again. That's the final sign. You no longer ask where God is, because you realize He never left. He was waiting for you in the silence the system taught you to fear. So now you know. God was never silent. You were just surrounded by voices so loud you forgot what silence sounded like. You were waiting for a miracle to appear, but the miracle was always awareness. The moment you stopped running, the moment you started listening, because clarity isn't what you find in the noise, it's what remains when the noise ends. The system wants your time, your thoughts, your attention, but God only wants one thing, your awareness, because awareness is the purest form of prayer. And maybe that's what this whole test was about. Not faith, not discipline, but attention, the new currency of creation. So ask yourself, when was the last time you heard silence and didn't try to escape it? Write it in the comments. When did you stop listening? And what finally made you hear again? Because the next chapter isn't about faith. It's about how the system sells purpose to those who lost focus. And once you see that trap, you'll never pray the same way again.